Please, would you
Hopefully.
like to put it on record? It's on record. Excellent.
Yep, no problem at all. So hopefully you can see my screen okay, and I will.
Good, good. You need to put it on presentation mode there. So I'll just introduce you for the audience, and then for the masses that will be listening to this later on YouTube, as we put it forth over our channel. So welcome everyone to another one of our sessions on this, the second day of the expert stage at our decarbonisation hack from home. We've been having a really interesting couple of days exploring how personal data can be used to drive decarbonisation, drive new behaviours, drive new processes and systems. And it's been a quite fascinating set of insights and talks we've heard on the expert stage, as well as I think some very interesting developments taking place within the project channels that have been taking place over Slack, where of course all of the action of this remote hackathon has been happening. We now have a talk coming up right now on one of the other elements of decarbonisation, another element of digital decarbonisation, which is the use of geospatial data, which is given by Energeo, who are one of our delivery partners, fellow delivery partners on the Eastern New Energy project, which is of course the ERDF funded project that has given us the funds to run this hackathon, and it's been prompted us to think about the role of data swift and decentralized personal data in decarbonisation. So without any further explanation from me, pass it over to you, Ian, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. Much appreciated. And good afternoon to everybody. My name is Ian D. I'm the co-founder and I'm also the Chief Executive Officer of Energeo Limited. And as James says this afternoon, what I wanted to do was give you a kind of a whirlwind overview of how geospatial data can create intelligence that accelerates decarbonisation and does that at scale as well. So a little bit about Energeo before we sort of start in anger. At Energeo, we create unique geospatially derived data for towns and cities looking to reduce emissions, improve their air quality, generate their own clean energy, and transition towards an electrified transport system. We do this by digitally studying the as-built environment using sources such as satellite imagery and digital mapping to automatically determine the most beneficial locations to deploy low carbon technologies, including rooftop and ground mount solar, large and small scale wind, energy efficiency measures, heat pumps, and electric vehicle charge points. Our non-intrusive approach reduces initial surveying costs, it accelerates the intelligence gathering process, and it enables stakeholders to focus on getting more technologies deployed faster and deployed in locations with a more immediate or a bigger impact. We also consider both the environmental and the financial benefits and implications of deploying low carbon technologies. And that really does provide a critical evidence base for ranking and prioritizing investments. So I want to talk about the problem. I think we all know that we're in the midst of a climate crisis and we know the causes of that. So I'm not going to bang on about global warming and 1.5 degree targets and all of that kind of thing. What I'd like to do is look at it from the perspective of a climate stakeholder, for example, a local authority or a municipality who have a mandate to decarbonise their town or city. So for them, what are the problems? I think the first and possibly the largest problem is the sheer complexity of the issue at hand. Decarbonisation can be tackled through multiple approaches. There are numerous stakeholders involved in the process, and there's also the intersection of the energy and the transport systems. Secondly, there's the cost, not just the cost of low carbon technologies themselves, but the cost of the wider infrastructure improvements that are needed and of the enablement. And by enablement, I mean planning, surveying, intelligence gathering, and strategizing. The total costs for all of these elements is expected to be around $1 trillion annually worldwide, though it has been suggested that over $2.5 trillion worldwide is actually needed. In the UK alone, we're looking at around 30 billion as a minimum spend in the next 10 years to meet 2030 targets. And thirdly, and our neat segue into all things geospatial, is actionable intelligence. It's becoming increasingly clear that the data needed to make critical decisions around decarbonisation is siloed, it's out of date, it's not comprehensive, or it just doesn't exist. And what we're finding is that better intelligence can massively reduce the scale and the impact of those first two problems around complexity and cost. I've included a quote from the Energy Systems Catapult's Data Task Force here, which I think captures this need for intelligence and the benefits of intelligence much better than I can myself. And so I've put that up on screen. I think if we just have a couple of seconds so people can read that quote, I think it encapsulates it really well, and then we'll move on. Okay, hopefully everyone's sort of taking that in and understands where we're coming from with the data and the intelligence piece there. So for many, they'll have heard the term geospatial, but they might not really understand what it is or what it represents. And it's a term that has grown in use and recognition in recent years. In simple terms, geospatial refers to data or technology focused on location. Ordnance Survey, the UK's national mapping agency, say everything happens somewhere. And I think that is a really apt way of outlining the scale of opportunity for geospatial. For those familiar, I apologise if I'm treading a little bit of old ground, but for the uninitiated, there are two main types of geospatial data, which is vector data and raster data. Vector data can be something like a point, a line, or a polygon, like you see on screen there, and rasters are grids of regularly sized pixels. Both vectors and rasters are linked to geographic location via a coordinate, which could be a latitude or longitude. In the UK, we have an easting or a northing, and they can also be associated with a height, and we can look at objects and features in 3 dimensions through that height value as well. To give you a bit of an example, a vector data set could be a series of points on a map showing the locations of a chain of restaurants across a town, whereas a raster could be a satellite image of that town. But getting into the meat of it a little bit, how do you turn vector and raster data sets into intelligence? And how do you specifically create intelligence that can accelerate decarbonisation? Luckily, I have a couple of examples, and they are real-world examples from projects that we've been involved in over the last 6 to 12 months. I wanted to start with rooftop solar, because solar is one of the most mature and widespread technologies. We've all seen it. I think we all understand how solar works. And it's a reliable source of renewable energy technology as well. And what that means that it is a key part of decarbonisation already, but it's also in most decarbonisation strategies across the world. In the UK, 85% of local authorities in the UK, so 350 out of 400 local authorities in the UK have solar as part of their decarbonisation strategy. In the UK, we are targeting an additional 27 gigawatt of solar by 2030, with 2/3 of that anticipated to be on roofs. But solar needs to be installed in specific conditions in order to efficiently turn the sun's energy into electricity. This includes the roof that it's being installed on being pitched and orientated in the right direction, or being flat enough to install solar on a pitched racking. And the roofs obviously need to have enough uninterrupted and unobstructed space to install the array. So how does vector and raster data help us? I'll use a real-world example from a recent project for Oxfordshire County Council. And we'll look at the city of Oxford, which you can see on screen there. The authority wanted to assess rooftop solar potential in order to inform its strategy to become net zero carbon by 2030. So here we have Oxford in a little bit more detail. This is simply the Google Earth image of Oxford. As with all cities, it is a very complex urban space, a mix of man-made assets, vegetation and water, various infrastructure, and a mix of commercial, industrial, and residential areas. Using vector data, however, we can rapidly remove all the features we're not interested in and focus in on those buildings and rooftops for our solar analysis, which you can see there on screen in yellow. So those are building footprint vectors from Ordnance Survey's MasterMap product, and they outline the location and the shape of all structures, and MasterMap data covers the whole of the UK. For those interested, there are approximately 65,000 addressable buildings in Oxford, of which around 55,000 are residential. So once we know where the buildings are, we can start to bring a raster data set into play. In this case, we're looking at LiDAR, which is a laser-derived 3D raster data set where each pixel also has a height value. allowing us to analyse the buildings, not just in 2 dimensions, but in 3. You can see the LiDAR, a subset of the LiDAR from Oxford on screen there. Having those 3 dimensions enables us to automatically assess those critical roof characteristics of pitch, aspects and unobstructed space. In this image, you can see the LiDAR classified by slope, where black pixels are flat and white pixels are near vertical. And once we know the pitch, aspect and unobstructed area, and we can calculate those, we can then estimate how much solar energy the roof will absorb and how many solar modules could be installed on the roof. And that lets us produce a geospatial intelligence data set for local authorities like this. And this is an indiscriminate database of rooftop solar potential of every building in the city of Oxford, which clearly identifies which buildings could generate the most clean energy. Within this database, we've also included the costs to install solar on each building, expected electricity savings within those buildings, and the CO2 reductions, of course, providing really the ideal evidence base for ranking and prioritising investment in solar as part of a wider decarbonisation strategy. Moving on, I'd like to actually take a look at a different example, a project we've recently undertaken for East Lothian Council in Scotland, and this focuses on EV charging. As we know, the growth in EV utilisation is huge. There are now over 400,000 EVs on the roads in the UK, and in some Scandinavian countries, EVs now represent around 50% of the entire market. Unfortunately, charging infrastructure isn't being installed at a similarly rapid rate, meaning that already there is a shortage of accessible and equitable charging options. The UK is targeting around 4 million new charge points by 2030 at costs estimated anywhere between £3.5 and £16 billion. East Lothian, like many local authorities, have very ambitious EV strategies, and East Lothian want to make EV charging infrastructure available to every citizen. That's not one charge point per citizen, but that's enough charge points to allow all citizens to transition to electric vehicles. However, understanding where demand for different types of charging solutions might come from is challenging across a wide area. They wanted to have the ability to identify who could charge freely at home, i.e. who has access to a driveway or private parking. In the UK, around 40% of residential properties don't have a driveway, whilst in many European nations, Spain and Germany, prime examples, this can be as high as 65 to 70%. East Lothian also wanted to know, for those who didn't have a driveway and then would require an on-street charging solution, what constraints to deployment were there? And finally, we wanted to assess whether existing EV charge points had a wide enough catchment area for local residents to use them conveniently. And that's where we'll start. Again, beginning with some vector data here. The white points you can see on screen, they are the locations of existing charge points in the East Lothian town of Musselburgh, which is just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. We then brought another vector data set into the analysis, Ordnance Survey's road network data. And this enables us to create what we call isochrones for 5-minute and 10-minute walking distances from the existing charge point locations. Now, an isochrone is a travel time, but rather than as the crow flies, it's a travel time along a network. And using a network gives us a much more accurate picture of on-the-ground travel. The isochrones let us establish how many people and properties were within a convenient distance of the charge points. And that's why we chose 5 and 10 minutes as thresholds for walking distances, because people are going to be carrying, potentially shopping home or running to their car in the rain in the morning to get to work. And people aren't going to want to do that over 15, 20, 30-minute journeys on foot. So 5 and 10 minutes is how we sort of selected those times. Now, the green vector on screen shows a 5-minute walking distance from East Lothian's existing charge point network in Musselburgh. And this yellow area is a 10-minute walking distance from existing charge points along their network. And as you can see, large parts of Musselburgh are already within 5 or 10-minute catchment areas of the existing charge points. However, those charge points aren't specifically designed for domestic and residential users, parking up, charging overnight for maybe 8 to 12 hours. They are journey chargers. So in the east, that's actually a park and ride bus terminal to and from Edinburgh, or they're destination chargers, such as in the west of the town, which are shops and leisure centres. So it's clear that additional infrastructure is needed to serve the rest of the town. So our next step was to establish who could and couldn't charge freely at home. For this, we used the Ordnance Survey building data again, as you saw in the Oxfordshire project, alongside the road network data from the previous slide. Using these two data sets together let us establish the proximity of each building to the road itself, which gave us a proxy for assessing the probability of the property having a driveway, because it allowed us to essentially measure the size of the property's front garden. Here you can see properties coloured green, which have a high probability of having a driveway and could install a charge point of their own volition, whilst red properties have low driveway probability and would need the council's support or third-party support to have an on-street charging solution installed. Then we brought some raster data into the analysis, and thinking of on-street charging in particular, one of the big constraints is how and where people park. The roads that need on-street infrastructure, are they already at their parking capacity? Where do people already park? Would you have to have a dedicated bay for the charge point and therefore displace other residents' vehicles from their usual spots or from outside of their own houses? All quite thorny issues and quite political issues that local authorities have to deal with, because people are quite precious about where they park their cars in their own local area. To help answer this question, we brought in some satellite imagery, specifically Pleiades from Airbus, and we used machine learning techniques to automatically identify static vehicles across the town, which you can see here on screen in yellow. Now, we call this just a car count, very simple. But what we do is we actually do this 3 or 4 times. So we take a historic set of satellite imagery and count the cars automatically on each of those images, and that lets us come up with a min, mean, max and standard deviation around the number of vehicles on street, how many vehicles are parked on certain streets, and the total volume of vehicles. One of the reasons we do that is if we just use one satellite image, we could get a skewed result, and we want to normalize that. For instance, if there was a sporting event on and people had traveled from outside of the town into the town to watch their football team play, we'd see more cars than we would ordinarily. So as you can see, actually combining both the vector and raster data sets enabled us to create these insights that helped East Lothian understand who could charge at home, who could use existing charge points, and who needed support through on-street infrastructure, and what some of the constraints to putting that infrastructure in place were. And East Lothian, actually, they used this intelligence to put a proposal together to central government, and the result of that was that they received a grant to fund the physical installation of charge points across the county, which was a return on investment for East Lothian of around 10 times. So to kind of sum up, I think what we've seen is examples of how geospatial data, both vector and raster, can be innovatively analysed and interrogated to support the enablement of low carbon technology deployment. And that facilitates that enablement element that we were talking about earlier. It's planning, it's intelligence gathering, it's surveying, and it's strategizing, which really is the starting point for climate stakeholders. I think we've seen how geospatial data can simplify the way a climate stakeholder looks at a complex problem, and also how it can help to solve the problems around lack of actionable intelligence by delivering objective intelligence, independent intelligence, empirically observed insights, and intelligence that's also up to date and can increase the stakeholders' appreciation of their assets' status and their assets' potential. We've seen how intelligence can be created automatically and non-intrusively, and that reduces the costs associated with the traditional or manual surveying and accelerates the intelligence gathering process. I know I am biased being a geospatial professional, but I believe we're kind of really at the start of the journey of what geospatial intelligence can do for decarbonisation. We're seeing examples here of static data, but IoT and smart devices are bringing near real-time data into the mainstream, and we're also now seeing huge growth in other energy and transport system areas in which geospatial intelligence can play a part. Think of smart grids, battery storage, and flexible generation. So hopefully my whistle-stop presentation has opened a few people's eyes to the art of the possible with geospatial data intelligence. I really appreciate everyone's time and attention, and maybe we even have time for a few questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. That was a really, really interesting and informative talk. Yeah, I feel like I just learned a lot listening to that.
Fantastic.
For instance, I had no idea about the way the different types of data are categorized in geospatial. So that was really interesting to hear. I think it really highlights the capacity of data, well-targeted data, to help policy interventions, like say, having the more public charging centers, as well as, encouraging private ones. I suppose I have the inevitable question to ask, given this is a hackathon on personal data and decarbonisation. Where would you see, if at all, the angle for geospatial and personal data? Do you see them matching together, or is geospatial fundamentally about different types of data as well, in your view?
Yeah, there is a huge role for personal data to play, and I think there's a couple of areas where that can happen. We've done projects in the past where we've integrated demographic data with our geospatial data, and whilst there are some good sources of quite coarse demographic data, the UK census is one example. Actually, if you can push that down to an individual property level, you can start to make some really granular assessments of what the best or most beneficial options are for individual properties. So we've done work in the past where we've integrated individual property level data back into our piece. What are people, what's the property tenure? Are the people in that property the house owner? Are they a private tenant? Are they a social tenant? What do they earn? Do they have are they in the able to pay bracket? Because low carbon technology is still seen as quite a high cost to be part of it, and bringing that kind of information in, which needs to be very, very compliant with a lot of the current privacy issues, GDPR obviously being the main one, and that can cause problems, but actually it's really good to kind of understand how that data plays a part as well. And it's been a bit of an eye-out for us, actually, because we're not used to having to understand about data opt-ins and getting people's permission to use their data. Geospatial data isn't around people generally. So I think that's one way that personal data can be used. If we know more about the person that lives in a building or works in a building, we can make much more informed decisions about the technologies that would suit their lifestyle and the properties that they live in. I think then there are other types of information that can really help. One is smart meter data. I think that, there's obviously a lot of information in that would be covered by the kind of the personal data element of this. It's got potentially people's names and addresses and contact details and their energy consumption data, which people might not want to be able to share. But if that can be shared in an anonymized way, potentially an aggregated way, understanding at that really, really detailed level the energy consumption patterns of any building can really help with how you consider deploying energy efficiency measures and low carbon technology into those properties. So there's a huge role, and I don't think we're doing enough on personal data and bringing it in at the moment, but I think we'll see more and more of that happening. The other one that we're starting to look at in a little bit of anger at the moment is mobile location data. And obviously, again, people can be quite concerned about how the data from their mobile phones is being collected and utilized. But if we can find a safe way and a private way and an anonymous way of sharing insights from people's mobile devices, we can get a really good insight into how people move, how they travel, where they're going to and from. And thinking about the e-mobility piece, actually changing a car for an electric car isn't the solution. Changing a car for active travel, a cycle, a walk, public transport, they're the solutions. And that mobile location data can help us unlock those elements, because I think last mile journeys are potentially one of the big problems. In the West Midlands, in Birmingham, it's something like 30% of all car journeys are less than a mile. So if we can unlock that location data from mobile devices, it is really high. It's scandalously high, really. But if we can understand why people are making those journeys in their car rather than on foot or on a bike, we can start to change the streetscape, open up reward systems for them taking more active travel options, and the mobile location data can help us do that. But of course, it needs to be safe, anonymized, and actually not contain any of those personal pieces of information.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, really, it seems like there's this whole world of possibilities just opening up to integrate geospatial. What would you say then, as we look forward to, the next few years, more and more data sets coming on stream, greater knowledge and awareness, we think and hope of the need to decarbonize. What interventions that use geospatial data in the next 5 years do you think would have the greatest impact?
I think there's quite a few areas. Geospatial is booming at the moment. One of the big changes that we're seeing with geospatial data at the moment is the frequency of when that data is collected. Now, at the moment, I talked about using satellite imagery. Satellite imagery from the Airbus satellite that I mentioned is collected of the same place on Earth once every 1.1 days, which sounds great. 365 satellite images of a town or a city a year. But think in the UK, do we get 365 days of cloud-free sunny skies? Unfortunately not, and therefore actually those 80% of those satellite images might be unusable because you simply can't see anything. But what we're seeing now is rather than one big satellite being launched that goes round and round and round and picks up data once a day, we're seeing constellations of small sats or CubeSats being launched. So we'll launch 20 smaller satellites and they can capture imagery of the same place on Earth 6, 7, 20 times a day. And that really does open up capturing data in between weather windows, monitoring how people move through their vehicles, if we're looking at the car counts, monitoring change at a much more granular level. So that'll really open things up. And I think really the other big part is this growth in IoT and smart devices. Mm-hmm. We've seen obviously IoT and smart devices for things like smart meters. We know mobile phone location and apps can contribute, but we're also seeing smart devices now being installed on substations so that we can see the amount of power going in and out of a substation at any time. And we know that in Britain, the grid is quite constrained in a lot of areas. So if we can understand the performance of the grid, and then we can create all this knowledge about where low carbon technology can go, we can start to potentially balance how that energy is generated and push back into the grid. And obviously it's cheaper to install solar and batteries on buildings or on the ground than it is to go and upgrade a substation and the power infrastructure associated with it. So it's really beginning to understand at 30-minute intervals, minute intervals, 30-second intervals, what's happening at certain locations. And I think those elements will really play a big part in the future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting talk. Yeah, I think that's pretty cool to listen to. We'll be sharing that on YouTube, so people from the hackathon can listen to it. When they're less busy with their projects, those of them who aren't here now, and then yes, other people on our channels. Thank you very much for coming. Really interesting, and I look forward to carrying on our conversations as we progress with the Eastern New Energy project in the months ahead.
Absolute pleasure. No problem at all. Thank you.